Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the East 10 Outpost. I'm Cody, and usually I'm your guide into curious mysteries of our ancient past, but not today. No hat, no fun gauntlets, no shtick. Nope, today I'm out of character and making a video that's going to actually be pretty serious. We're going to be diving into the headspace of John Hoops, a KU archaeologist and behavioral scientist who has somehow fallen off of the wagon and lost his way and not just become an embarrassment to the wider academic community, but a generally miserable person, a bully, an insecure little man. But how did a prestigious academic turn into such a sniveling little coward? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be taking a look at. And like the IRS, I've got receipts, so buckle up and hold tight as we dive into a psychoanalysis of John Hoops. So for those of you who might not already be aware, John Hoops is a behavioral scientist and an archaeologist at the University of Kansas, and he's supposed to understand human behaviors, but it seems like he really doesn't. So let's take a look at his behaviors, shall we? Because what I've uncovered, he isn't a scientist. He's a trembling, small-minded little man driven by an insecure need to control and gatekeep. But what led John to be that way? When you look at his fraudulent archaeology wall of shame group, it's a playground for his fractured psyche. But again, I ask, how did he get to that point? So let's take a look at John's life and explore some of the things that could have potentially led to him becoming the small-minded, quivering little man that he is today, that is driven by a need to bully and put down others to feel self-important. So let's dive into that sad little mind and root around and see what we can find. So what mental traumas led to John Hoops being the way that we see him today? Well, let's rewind the clock and take a look at the psychology of it all as we dive into his background. Hoops comes from a high-achieving family. His father, Dr. Johnny Hoops, was a professor at Johns Hopkins, and his grandfather held a senior position at Dow Chemical in Spain. This likely placed immense pressure on a little baby Hoops to succeed, fostering a deep fear of failure. Growing up in the shadow of such accomplishments, he may have internalized a need to prove himself, terrified of never quite measuring up. His own academic journey only amplified this pressure. Hoops graduated from Yale, earned his PhD at Harvard in 1987, and joined the University of Kansas in 1989, where he stayed for a whopping 36 years. Despite a respectable publication record with over 50 published works and an H-index of 22, his career seems to have plateaued a while ago. A 2005 National Science Foundation grant was the last big highlight, but the lack of recent major awards or a move to a more prestigious institution are probably making him feel stagnant, especially when you compare him with some of his more successful and well-known peers. And of course, that fear of stagnation is only compounded and made worse by his incredibly modest online presence. On Blue Sky, where he's the most active, he has just 5.6K, but that's his largest following anywhere. If you compare that to Jimmy Corsetti of Bright Insight, one of John's frequent targets, Jimmy has 1.69 million YouTube subscribers, delving into ancient mysteries that John Hoops dismisses offhand as pseudo-archaeology. For anyone keeping track, that's over 300 times difference. And for an Ivy League academic, it must sting pretty good to be outshined by an independent researcher. Then there's Matt Bell, the host of the Limitless podcast with over 50,000 YouTube subscribers and growing by the day. Matt gives a voice to alternative history figures like Danny Hillman and many others who Hoops has targeted directly. Matt has interviewed numerous Cosmic Summit speakers, yet Hoops hasn't ever been invited to share his perspective. The exclusion likely fuels his resentment, as Hoops no doubt feels he's entitled to such interviews and no doubt feels that his status should award him the kind of numbers that Jimmy is able to get. With such a tiny following, Hoops absolutely feels insignificant, driving him to lash out at alternative voices to try and reassert his authority. Being sidelined by Matt's platform could have made him feel excluded, intensifying his need to gatekeep it in spaces that he can control, like the fraudulent archaeology Wall of Shame group, where his all-star contributor role gives him exactly the validation that he feels like he needs. John's public persona offers some very interesting clues as well. A 2017 Lawrence Journal World article described him as passionate but reserved during a KU lecture, yet online he's snarky and vindictive, dismissing alternative voices with eye rolls and snowflakes are melting comments. This duality suggests a compartmentalized personality. He suppresses his insecurities in professional settings but unleashes them when he feels like he's safe online and can mock others freely. Psychologically, this indicates a lack of emotional integration, often linked to unresolved fears of vulnerability. Now, as a professor at KU, he emphasizes structure and independence in his students, avoiding overly dependent relationships, which further reflects on his aversion to vulnerability, a trait that aligns with his gatekeeping behavior. Public records indicate that he's lived in a home in Lawrence, Kansas since 1992 that's valued today at around $350,000, which is plenty stable but far from extravagant. Coming from such a high-achieving family, this might feel like just another way he's failed to keep up. This pressure, combined with a stagnant career, a small online following, and a string of being overlooked by podcast platforms, likely created a perfect storm. A man desperate to control narratives, terrified of irrelevance, and driven to lash out at anyone who threatens his fragile authority. Hoops isn't a scientist. He's a walking trauma case, and it's borderline pathetic to watch. And now let's zoom out to Hoops' fraudulent archaeology Wall of Shame group, where he's a all-star contributor, because this is really why I made the video. This group isn't about science or history. It's really just a weird high school clique where they dogpile and gang up on anybody with a perspective different than their own. In a couple of particularly bothersome comments, they targeted a specific researcher, mocking their appearance with comments like, "looks crazy like a leprechaun," and "has one brain cell." The bullying drove this researcher to express suicidal thoughts because of the group's constant mockery, and Hoops didn't show an ounce of remorse. He mocked him further, calling him a snowflake. That's not just hypocrisy, it's a betrayal of his own field. Where are your ethics, John? Hoops is a behavioral scientist. He should know full well the ramifications that kind of outright mockery could have when somebody's expressing thoughts like that. And he didn't care a bit. John's playing with fire while someone's life is hanging in the balance, and he has zero remorse. It's not just cruel, it's abhorrent. And sadly, that's far from the only example of John just outright putting people down or mocking them. It's a regular habit of his and something he seems to get off on quite a bit. Let's look at some more examples. In one post, Hoops sarcastically shared a promo for the Raiders of the Past podcast with an eye roll. He's also called Danny Hillman Nottawajia's Gunyung Pudang claims spurious. He's mocked Luke Cavern's success, asking, "Pseudo-archaeology pays? How about the real thing?" instead of being happy for the guy that he was able to quit his day job and buy a house. He's posted on Blue Sky, "Archaeologists absolutely do have the right to mock and smear the work of those who suggest alternative perspectives," with laughing emojis. Hoops preaches scientific rigor, but outright mocks and endorses the mockery of alternative perspectives. That's not scientific rigor, John. That's clown behavior. Now let's contrast John Hoops and his weird behavior directly with one of his peers, a fellow archaeologist who's also in the fraudulent archaeology Wall of Shame group, but takes a dramatically different approach to things. I'm talking about Dr. Ed Barnhart. Ed Barnhart, who earned his PhD in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin in 2001, is the founder and director of the Maya Exploration Center and a fellow of the Explorers Club. He's a public speaker who's appeared on the History Channel and Discovery Channel, sharing his expertise on ancient American civilizations with a global audience. While Hoops has a modest 5.6K followers on Blue Sky, Barnhart's public presence is far more substantial. His work reaches thousands through media appearances and educational tours, reflecting a genuine commitment to engaging the public. On October 7, 2024, Barnhart posted in the group, quote, "I share knowledge, but I don't believe I have the right to tell people what to think. Shunning or shaming isn't the path," end quote. Barnhart's a real scientist, empathetic, constructive, focused on education over ego. He explores controversial topics like ancient Amazonian civilizations, as noted in an October 4, 2024 Express article, but does so with curiosity, not condensation. Hoops, meanwhile, can't handle alternative perspectives without resorting to snark and bullying, as seen in his "snowflakes are melting" sneer. Barnhart builds bridges to the wider community while Hoops burns them down, too insecure to engage without tearing down others. The contrast couldn't be any more clear. Dr. Ed Barnhart is exactly the scientist that John Hoops wishes he could be, but his fragile ego just won't let him. I also find it incredibly ironic that his group's rules even state, "Be kind and courteous, don't hate/bully." John apparently doesn't give a shit about these rules because he's frequently the one encouraging and enabling the cruelty. So he's failed as a scientist and as a group leader. Congrats, John. That's 2 failure counts with 1 point. As we've already seen, the Fraudulent Archaeology Wall of Shame group is a who's who of insecure individuals, but Hoops is usually front and center. Here's another example of a post shared by Hoops trashing all history as pseudo, while a member compared it to Nazi pseudoscience. I find that incredibly ironic, given the work that John's father was a pioneer of. This isn't a critique, it's a smear campaign, and Hoops feels all of it. The group's dynamics are mob mentality. They mock appearances, dismiss ideas without evidence, and revel in tearing people down. Hoops, as an all-star contributor, sets this tone. His snark gives the group permission to pile on. As a behavioral scientist, he should stop this, but he doesn't, because it feeds his shriveled little ego. Hoops needs the group to prop up his fragile authority, some sort of deranged puppet master reveling in the misery that he's helped create. He enables a toxic group because it props up his fragile ego. Hoops should be a role model for scientific discourse, but instead, he's a gatekeeper who would rather harass people than debate them. His ivory tower is crumbling, and these receipts more than prove it. John Hoops, you're not a scientist. You're a mental midget with a PhD. You're a bully, and you won't be remembered for a rich legacy in the archaeological field. You'll be remembered as a toxic individual who set an example of how not to be. And that's it. John, I'm speaking directly to you now, buddy. Hopefully, you'll take this as a warning, maybe even a lesson or an opportunity. Because, John, whether you realize it or not, people hold you to a higher standard. People like myself would love to learn from you, but you don't afford us that opportunity. You would rather shut us down than actually earnestly try and educate anybody. Unless somebody's willing to take everything you say and instill it 100% and never question a thing, you don't want to teach. You're a failure in your field, John, and I hope that's something that you think about and maybe make some changes on, because it's disappointing to say the least. We hold you to a higher standard than jabronis like myself who make YouTube videos that hardly anybody's going to watch anyway. You, John, you're up here. I'm down here. Or at least that's how it should be. Yet, the way you carry yourself isn't that way at all. So, like I say, use this as an opportunity to do better. Be a better leader in your group. Be a kinder person. It's actually good for your heart. I don't know if you realize that or not, but being a kinder person makes the whole world a better place. So, this is a warning shot for you and all your buddies in the group, because I don't actually like doing this kind of thing. I get no enjoyment from it. I've spent days feeling ugly after seeing that post that you made, wondering what could be done. And so I made this video, and now your mask is off for the entire world to see exactly who you are, John. And it's a pretty ugly sight. Do better. But until next time, I hope everybody gives this some thought. Maybe choose kindness instead of ugliness today. And no matter what you do, stay curious, my friends. I'm Cody, and I'll see you next time back here at the East 10 Outpost.